Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I'll be splitting my time with the Honourable Member from Newton North Delta. And I'm pleased to speak on C-21, particularly given the importance of white-collar crime in this country. Over the last few years, we've seen more and more of these cases. And we know that, for example, Madam Speaker, that the Canadian Securities Administrators note that at least 5% of adult Canadians have been affected in one way or the other by this white-collar crime situation, and the fact that this fraud, and over 1/3 of it, in fact, of these large numbers are victims that are seniors who have invested money, who have obviously been misled, and these people then take the money and then often it's not recoverable. We also note with interest, Madam Speaker, that corporations have estimated that between 2 and 6% of their annual profits are affected by white-collar crime. This, of course, over the last few decades has totaled billions and billions of dollars. And so both the average individual in this country and corporations are affected by the activities of these fraudsters who clearly prey, in many cases, as I've indicated, on seniors, on the most vulnerable in our society. And in doing so, that is something that we welcome, the government's finally legislation on this, and obviously support it going to committee to be reviewed. This legislation has a minimum mandatory sentence of imprisonment for 2 years for fraud valued at over $1 million. We could get into the issue of where people stand on mandatory minimums, but the reality is that the courts need to be much tougher on these individuals who prey on the most vulnerable, who clearly take people's life savings, and we've seen cases recently where these situations have occurred, and in doing so have caused great personal trauma for people. The Jones case in Quebec, we've seen these cases where people believe that the individual before them is in fact a reputable individual who comes and says that they're going to be able to invest their money, their hard-earned money, into certain investments where they will in fact keep them for their retirement, and yet it turns out, of course, that they are victimized and the penalties are not tough enough. But also, not only do we have to look at the penalties, we have to look at the issues of prevention. How do we stop the fact that 2 to 6% of corporation profits are lost? How do we stop the fact that 5% of Canadians have in fact been victimized? And that obviously the committee will have to examine this, but again, it's not simply about the penalties. It has to be about how do we do better in terms of dealing with these kind of individuals who are preying on our society. Prevention obviously is important, and one of the things that this bill does not address is the issue of which the opposition has called for, and certainly people in the public have called for, that is the end of the 1/6 accelerated parole provisions for these offenders. There's absolutely no reason why this provision should still be there, and hopefully the committee, Madam Chair, will deal with that issue. That is one of the shortcomings that we see in this proposed legislation. There's no question, Madam Speaker, that this legislation has been a long time coming. It would have been dealt with earlier, although, as you know, just before Parliament was prorogued, there was legislation. That legislation then basically sat there. Now we're back with new legislation under C-21. But the Earl Jones case in Quebec, the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme that was in the United States, all of these are examples, are systematic of the kind of individuals that are out there that prey on people, and why we need to have tougher legislation. We need to have legislation that only, in my view, not only includes the mandatory minimum, but also deals with the sentencing issue, the psychological and financial impact on individuals. Now, we are going to have in the legislation victim impact statements. That'll be, of course, after the sentencing. But I think, just as it is with an individual who is a victim of a mugging or of an offense of that nature, the psychological impacts and the financial impacts in this case are quite significant. And I think that's important. And it's important that the courts look at those victim impact statements as well. Obviously, what mitigating factors were involved, but obviously these things have a very long-term effect. I have constituents in my own riding of Richmond Hill who have been victims of white-collar crime. And I can tell you that some of these people, it's been 10 years after, and they still are feeling the effects. Both, they blame themselves in many cases, Madam Speaker, which they shouldn't do, but they blame themselves because how could I have been taken in by this individual? How could I have been so gullible? And therefore they come and say, well, what are the penalties? And often it's more than just, it's simply a slap on the wrist, and this is why the mandatory minimum is obviously important. But it's also important to look at those impact statements, the community impact statements as well. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, of course, have indicated their support for this. The Canadian Bar Association has concerns about the minimum mandatory issue. But again, we need to deal with the reasons for these white-collar crimes. We need to deal with what are the regulations. One of the issues that this House has been dealing with as well is the issue of the securities commissions and the fact that we have 13 across Canada and the issue of a national regulator. And I have always been, and when I was a former parliamentary secretary to do Ministers of Finance, we promoted the idea of a national regulator. The government is again talking about a national regulator. The issue of a national regulator, of course, is important because, again, trying to keep track of investments and the fact that if you're overseas and you're looking to investing in Canada, it doesn't make a lot of sense that we have these 13 bodies. But as well, there are other issues. There's about, I believe, Madam Speaker, there are about 50 entities as well that are also involved in the issue of regulations, 50 entities involved as well in dealing with the issue of enforcement, investigation, coordination, etc. So we have a very bureaucratic system, which is often why these kind of cases slip through the cracks and why these people are able to, in fact, advance their particular agenda on individuals who are unwittingly fall victim to this. The issue of course, the recouping of dollars. What do these people, when they have taken this money, the issue of how do we get this money back if, in fact, any of it is recoupable, how do we get that? In terms of where have they put it? Have they put it offshore? Have they simply spent it? What are again, the tough penalties to deal with individuals who do this? We're talking, I had a case in my own riding of an individual who was an elderly lady who had invested $10,000. And again, they felt that up front that this was a reliable individual she was dealing with. And unfortunately, she never recouped that $10,000. And you know, when you're an elderly person and that kind of savings is gone, it has a tremendous impact. And again, the question is, what is it that we are doing as legislators to not only deal with the proponents who are involved in this kind of white-collar crime activity, but what are we doing as well in terms of prevention? How can we be tougher in terms of the regulations? How can we be tougher in terms of the monitoring? Those are the kind of things that people want to see. And again, so I think that this bill deals with part of that, but it doesn't deal enough on the prevention side. Again, I hope the committee will do more with that. The victim restitution issue is obviously going to be extremely important because, again, that is something that at the end result people are most concerned about. And obviously in terms of how did that impact on an individual and their families and in their community so that they, how do we get the word out, what happens to these people? And of course some would argue that a minimum of 2 years isn't even strong enough. But I think from our standpoint, from the Liberal standpoint, we do believe that there needs to be strong provisions put in place. And if we hadn't paroled, we probably would have had this a lot earlier. But again, we've got to, I think, hopefully move quickly on a bill of this nature because this addresses an issue in our society which is becoming more rampant. And when you think of 5% of Canadian adults have been in one way victimized by white-collar crime, that is quite significant. So I again look forward to future deliberations on this, Madam Speaker. Thank you.